Okay, I've been told that I've got 15 minutes, and this is a topic dear to my heart, and I've written a lot, so we're going to go through this pretty quickly. Okay, so the first thing is, what is a wild fish? And the simplest definition is a river-borne fish. No other definition counts. The gold standard are river-borne fish that are derived from river-borne rather than hatchery-reared stock, and that every subsequent generation has been river-borne. And you might say, why does that matter? It matters because wild fish are better and more robust than domestic fish. For a start, they're beautiful to look at. They live for a long time, and that's been evident in all these talks that we've had, where you can put your hatchery fish in, and if it's a robust wild fishery, the hatchery fish don't last very long, and the wild fish maintain themselves. But most importantly, wild fish exhibit thrilling and diverse behaviour. So I want you to have a look at some of these pictures here. We're going to go... that's charging around on bait fish, and anyone who's done that will understand the thrill. Tailing fish in Tasmania. Leaping after black spinners. Peter Broomhall's photos are pretty good, aren't they? And in addition to that, you'll find wild fish swimming open-mouthed through schools of water fleas like basking sharks. They're literally filter feeding. You'll see them zooming around in the shallows on mud-eyes. You'll see them porpoising in offshore wind lanes. Now, every one of those behaviours has a genetic basis. And so this is why, when you maintain a wild population, you see all those diverse feeding opportunities, whereas if you put domestic fish in, even if those food resources exist, those behaviours often don't occur. When we dream of where we want to go in the world, we tend to dream of wild fisheries. So you may dream of going to Tasmania's Western Lakes, or you may dream of going to New Zealand backcountry streams, or Mongolia's taimen, cutthroat fishing in Yellowstone, salmon fishing in Alaska. What's in common with all these things? These are all wild fisheries. And don't underestimate your own backyard. We all get pretty blasé about our own backyard, but I fish Victoria a lot, and I treasure my time in Victoria. I fish the Victorian Highlands, and it's Gondwanan country. There's nothing like this anywhere in the world. Don't underestimate what you've got. And the places I go to are always wild fisheries. So you need to preserve that. How many of you actually dream of going overseas to catch someone else's tatty hatchery-reared rainbows? And that's the point. You know, it's hardly surprising because hatchery-reared fish, by and large, tend to be drab and soft-bodied. They tend to have eroded fins and facial deformations. And they're weak, and most of all, they don't live long in the wild. Being drab and relatively easy to catch, they quickly become humdrum. And beginners might enjoy immediately after a stocking the relative ease of capture, but that doesn't last long. And in any case, everyone, you can only stay when you're a skier on beginner slopes for so long. You eventually want to go out and do the real thing. So wild fish fill the void because they actually provide a meaningful challenge to the angler, which begs the question, why do managers stock at all? Now, managers can stock for very good reasons. In Tasmania, we're lucky because we have such robust wild fisheries with lots of natural spawning. But we also have some lakes that have no spawning facilities, and they can be big lakes with cold water, and you do need to stock those. Similar thing in Victoria, much more common in Victoria. And occasionally, as the other speakers have said, you'll get disasters. You get big droughts that can wipe a fish population out completely. You can get pollution and poison events that will do the same thing, and some reseeding can actually be a genuine help. But sometimes fishery managers just fall into the trap of stocking just so they can be seen to be doing something. And this is despite the fact that, particularly if you're stocking catchable fish, they're ridiculously expensive to produce, like ridiculously expensive, and they don't last long. So the benefits aren't that good. When hatchery fish are placed into streams that already have robust populations of wild fish, not only do they disappear, but in the time that they're there, they interfere with the wild fish. And what you notice afterwards, and this has been proven all over the world, is that your wild fish population goes through a bit of a hiatus. You tend to get a period where they don't feed as well, and sometimes too you'll get interbreeding, or you'll get disruption at spawning time on your wild fish. So you're just better off not doing that if you've got a wild fishery. Hauck was a great case in point. Big, robust fishery, really doesn't need stocking. Now, the thing about stocking versus not stocking, Tasmania was the place in the world that pioneered the idea that putting hatchery fish in robust wild fisheries was a complete waste of time. We had Risley Hobbs from New Zealand who had done a paper on it. His work was backed up by a scientist, Nichols, and we trialled the shutting down of hatcheries in Tasmania before anyone else in the world, and it was a screaming success. None of the waters that where stocking stopped went in decline, and some of them actually improved. It was so successful that it was adopted in Yellowstone National Park, and because they're dealing with cutthroat trout, they saved the Yellowstone fishery. To give you an idea, in most brown trout are only caught, they're hard to catch. So in most rivers, you're lucky to catch a brown trout twice over a course of a year. In Yellowstone River downstream of the lake, a lot of these fish have been caught 10 times in the summer period, once they introduced catch and release fishing. Prior to that, they were stocking and getting nowhere. Reducing catch was the thing that saved the fishery. Now, Tasmania, sometimes this corporate knowledge of stocking tends to fall off the radar, and then you go back and reinvent the wheel. And Tasmania went through a phase in the 2000s of ramping up stocking again. And this sort of dismayed the old hands. You know, the fishery was performing really well. Why would you do it? Now, the pressures behind it are quite obscure. Like in Tasmania, we've got fish farming, and the fish farmers, particularly for Atlantic salmon and ocean trout, they end up with a lot of runts and old brood stock. They need to get rid of them. Public relations exercise, offer it to the public for nothing. Good for them, and they don't have to pay for the disposal of fish. Bad for us, because they've got to be put somewhere, and there's not many fisheries in Tasmania that actually need stocking. The other thing is that historically, the Inland Fisheries Service ran the quaint little salmon ponds hatchery at Plenty, and then you've got a new generation of fish farmers that come along and say, well, you know, it's a bit antiquated, this thing. What you need is like a recirculating factory, and you can put it in suburbia. And so there's a lot of political pressure then to do that, which is what you do. And suddenly you end up with a whole heap of fish. And where the question used to be, where do we need to stock? And perhaps it might be better to translocate wild fish to those waters. The question then becomes, if it's a tail wags dog, we've got all these fish, where the hell are we going to put them? And then you're looking for a place to dump them, and they get dumped in wild fisheries like Brady's Lake. And predictably, and I say predictably because this has been proven decade after decade all over the world, catch rates drop, angler satisfaction drops, and there's an exodus from the stock waters to waters that are being maintained by natural recruitment. And I'm pleased to say that Tasmania has relearnt the lessons of the past, and we're back on track. There's a great big push again for wild trout because it's cheaper and it's better. One thing I'd like to mention, sometimes stocking seems sensible but isn't. So a classic example in Tasmania is a big cormorant invasion. Cormorants come in, eat a lot of fish, catch rates drop a little bit, call goes out to restock the fishery. The problem with this is that if you restock domestic fish into a river when the cormorants are still there, you're just providing expensive trout to feed your cormorants and giving them a reason to linger. And if you wait until they move on, by the time you've noticed that the cormorants have moved on, the river's already on an upswing. And then there's a period after the cormorant invasion where perhaps the stocks are a little bit lower than they used to be, but what you end up with is a smaller number of bigger fish for a couple of years. And that dynamic, that unpredictability in a river is one of the major attractions for experienced fishermen. It's cheaper and it's more sustainable. Now, I want to talk too about how quickly fish can become domesticated. Have a think about it. How many generations would you have to hold fish in a hatchery before you actually had domestic traits? The answer may shock you if you don't already know. It is less than one generation. It is less than one generation. This was discovered in Vancouver Island when they were looking at their steelhead sea-run rainbow fishery. Through bad logging practice, they lost pretty much all their steelhead fishery in Vancouver, and they started saying, well, we'll stock it with hatchery red smolts to bring it back. It didn't work. The next idea was, okay, well, we know that domestic fish are bad. So what we'll do is we'll go out to the river and we will get the wild fish when they come up and spawn. We'll strip the eggs on site. We'll take the eggs back to the hatchery. We'll hatch them out and we'll just rear them to smolt size, the size they run to sea, about yay big. And they took all those fish back and they released them on the spawning site. And you're thinking, we're all thinking, that's pretty good, except it didn't work. So they got some geneticists to have a look at this, and it turns out the geneticists could tell with stunning accuracy which fish were hatched in the river and stayed in the river, and which fish were taken from the river, hatched in the hatchery. They were genetically distinct. And it seems that whereas the river is selecting for fish that can survive in the wild, a hatchery is selecting for fish that can survive in a hatchery. We know the gene markers, don't quite know what they do, but we suspect that it is because hatcheries select for fish that are not so scared of people and who adapt well to hatchery feeding. But the point is, the only way to recover your wild fishery is to look after the environment. Now, when you look after the environment, one thing we can say is, okay, having nice quality water and nice landscapes is great, but it goes beyond that. When we say look after the environment, we're not necessarily talking about works or conservation measures on a specific lake or river. Looking after wild waterways goes well beyond that. And I'll give you an example. I started fishing in Europe 20 years ago. In that time, the biomass of flying insects has crashed by 80%. Now, a river, the aquatic insects in the river can only do so much. Just by the way, that's a hatchery fish. Have a look at the deformed dorsal fin and the deformed gill cover compared to wild fish. Just something about wild fish too. In their native habitats, wild fish adapted to niche environments within a lake or a river, and they are genetically distinct and they don't interbreed, but they're not so distinct that they are classified as distinct species. Now these are char from Lake Thingvallavatn in Iceland. They have 4 races of char, all of which have arisen since the last glaciation about 10,000 years ago. Taxonomists won't classify them as separate species, but they don't interbreed. The one on the left is a filter feeder, long head, big gill rakers. The one on the right is a snail feeder that's found around the shore, and it's got a short stubby mouth that's good for grinding up snails. These things don't interbreed in the lake. They also have a giant fish-feeding char, and they have a tiny little char that flits around in lava fissures like coral gardens. That sort of diversity used to exist in every lake in Europe. And the problem was hatchery fish. When you put hatchery fish in there, the hatchery fish don't know who to breed with. They breed with everything, and you end up with a single generic fish that is sort of okay at living almost everywhere, but not very good. So it means the carrying capacity of the lake plummets. These fish, you could destroy the Thingville and char fishery simply by putting hatchery fish in there. Within 10 years, all that diversity would be gone. So getting back to our insect thing. In Europe, 80% of your terrestrials have disappeared. You don't get that in the rivers I used to fish in anymore. Some other insects, these ones, so ants, really heavily affected by pesticides and industrial scale farming, which is the reason for the lack of flying insects. The top right is a jacid. They are leaf hoppers. They live in Tasmania on gum trees. They're affected by forestry pesticides. The great thing about them is they happen in late in the season, so they extend the time that you get rising fish. Gum beetles, little story about gum beetles. When I first started working for inland fisheries, we had a reported fish kill in the Florentine River, went out and had a look. Forestry had sprayed the area with atrazine. The gum beetles died, they fell in the river, the fish ate the poison beetles and the fish all died. And cicadas are affected by 1080 poison, and it's a bit of a problem in New Zealand too. But my point here is that when you go to look after a wild fishery, the things that you're fighting against are things that go well beyond what actually happens in the river. Looking after a wild fishery is a really complex business, and it requires scientific research and tremendous powers of political persuasion. It costs money. It costs a lot of money to do it, and unlike stocking, it's sometimes really hard to see where your money is being spent, or at least the value of it. But the bottom line is that if you want a fishery that's affordable and diverse and productive and fun, and that inspires enough enthusiasm and wonder to maintain your passion for a lifetime, this is where your licence money needs to be spent. So by hosting this event, the VFA has shown that it actually understands the truth that looking after wild fish is the best way to look after anglers. And I'm urging all of you to support the VFA's scientific research, its rehabilitation programs and its political manoeuvrings, because that's where the future lies. That's where you'll get the best result from your fishing. Whoop. Wild trout matter. Thanks.
And there is an incredible